I've seen really stupid lawsuits, ridiculous claims, and I will preface this by saying that obviously everything in this video is my opinion, since I don't want to open myself up to what I would consider an equally pointless lawsuit. But apparently Activision is, which I've criticized many times for a lot of things that they've done, is being sued by the families of a school pew-pewing. It's unfortunate that I have to change my words because of putting this video on YouTube, where I'm not allowed to actually say certain words or I get demonetized, which is very unfortunate. But I'm sure you're smart enough to know what I'm talking about. This was obviously a senseless act of violence in Uvalde. And look, there are a couple things we're going to talk about today with this. Now, I'm not exactly an expert when it comes to acts of violence. I'm just an average everyday person providing my personal insight into it. But as someone who grew up around guns, as somebody whose dad was winning trap and skeet competitions, that's not really a brag. I'm just saying we had guns in the house. And as somebody who played violent video games, I never once had the idea to try and obtain these weapons, which I was taught were actual tools that, depending on how you use them, could be for defense, could be for sport, or could be to just straight up take life senselessly. I was never someone who had the idea that I should go and take these things and use them to hurt people. It didn't cross my mind. I knew that you could. I wasn't stupid. It's not like I thought, oh, look, a toy. I knew what they could do, but I was never somebody who thought, boy, I played Call of Duty. I played Medal of Honor. Maybe some of you will remember that game. I really miss those back when they were good and existed. Boy, I should really take this and do something, horrible with it. I never thought that. But unfortunately, for many, many decades now, people have been scapegoating, in my opinion at least, to avoid tough questions. Now, those tough questions are not something that we will ever solve overnight. They are not something that I can solve for you or for anyone else. But they are questions of balancing things like the Second Amendment. It's something very important in our country with the law. I think the amendments from the Founding Fathers and the Constitution and all those things are very important. With the fact that human nature is flawed, with the fact that we have a lack of morality, honestly, in a lot of our culture now, especially in America, to be able to balance these things and to think about them and say, okay, well, what do we do? Do we prioritize freedom and we sacrifice safety and people die? Or do we prioritize safety like we did after the horrible tragedies of the World Trade Center and we, lose freedoms? Those are questions that people have to debate. Those are questions where you're going to have to look at research and say, okay, well, are there warning signs we can see? Is there laws that can be changed to still promote the Second Amendment or to still promote, obviously, our Constitution, but not to allow easily things to fall into the wrong hands? Those are questions, right? Those are honest questions. Now, you might absolutely fall hard in the camp of hey, you know what? Look at all these other countries. They don't have access to these weapons and they're doing just fine. We shouldn't either. Or you might fall in the camp of the Second Amendment is my God-given right. I'm not letting it go. And I'm an absolutist. Personally, I'm not a centrist. I wouldn't call myself an absolutist on much of anything. I like to think that when it comes down to it, there's usually answers to questions that we kind of need to look at a little more carefully. Sometimes we need to, even if we don't like it, make some amount of concessions or some amount of ability to meet across party lines and make these choices. But in my opinion, when you have lawsuits like this, when you have lawsuits that take tragedies and they point them at surface level things, they point them at movies or video games or books or anything like that, to me, that is very, very disingenuous. It's very much something that takes away from the awfulness, I should say, of what happened, right? And as someone who lives in the US, this is something that our government was highly criticized for, after the World Trade Center, just for an example here. I know a lot of people are not old enough in my audience to even remember that, but I was born back in 94, and I was a young kid when it happened, and I am old enough to remember it. And I'm old enough to remember how the world changed and how people together kind of decided that they were so scared that they wanted the safety more than the freedom. And that was their decision to make. There are certainly things I disagree with in that, and there are certainly some changes that I think were probably good. But at the end of the day, that was the decision that people made following that. But there has been a lot of criticism that the US government used that tragedy in order to gain more power. Now, at the end of the day, when we are dismissing real life things, we're not having those discussions really, but we are targeting something unrelated. Because in here, they do go after other things too. Like they do go after Daniel Defense, I believe, with this. So, like, for example, there are other companies in this where there's like these lawsuits that are essentially tied together. And what it's going after is the manufacturer of the AR-15, I believe, which is Daniel Defense. They're also going after the Meta platform, I believe, which is essentially the owner of Facebook, Instagram, all these things. And they made these claims that they took place in grooming this person to do this violent act. What's unfortunate to me, by the way, I'm not even going to name the person's name who did this, because I think that if you do this kind of thing, you're a coward who deserves to be forgotten. Like, I think your actions should be pointed to as like a, wow, this is horrifically bad, and we should not, endorse that, obviously. But at the end of the day, I don't like drawing attention to the names of these people, because I think a lot of times these people who are very troubled, they want to be remembered. They want to be someone who is looked back at who made a difference. If you look back at the two people who did Columbine, that was a big thing, was like being remembered and like, look at us now. And, now you're finally paying attention to us. And unfortunately, a lot of people play into that. There is a very fascinating world and a very fascinating, I don't know what I would say. Like, it is fascinating to look at the darkness of the human mind, to see what people are capable of. So I'm not saying that this lawsuit doesn't go after some real things too, but for me, when I'm looking at this, my opinion when I see a lawsuit like this is that it is genuinely just actually trivializing the loss of life. Like, what this kind of thing does is it makes the situation far less serious. Now, if you want to go after a manufacturer of something, I'd argue they're probably not responsible for how the thing is used, but that's for the courts to decide, I suppose. There's been lawsuits that are extremely silly that have won that I would argue shouldn't have, but again, I'm not in the court system. But when you start going after things like social media platforms, unless they're directly encouraging some type of behavior. Like if there was some kind of social media platform that was like, hey, we'll give you a bonus for streaming acts of mass violence. Here's a financial incentive. It's like, well, of course, like that obviously would be cause to go after something and be like, hey, look, this directly contributed to this person's decision. They wanted this money, like this incentive. I'm not seeing anything like that here. What I'm unfortunately seeing is something where with a lot of lawsuits, though I can't legally say that's what these people are doing because it seems like they're willing to sue anyone for a buck. That's my opinion on it. With a lot of lawsuits, what you do is you sue as many things for as much as you can, and you either reach a settlement to get a bunch of money, or you drag it out and you get a ton of money by the end if you win. And unfortunately, when I'm looking at things like this, what I'm seeing is a culture that is unable to take any kind of responsibility for its actions. My question, and this is a question Jill posed to me, who probably you might have heard move through the room in the background, is where does this kind of thing end? Do we go after, just an example, I wouldn't want to see this, but do we go after games that are towards younger audiences now? Because Call of Duty, from Activision, that's something for 17-year-olds and up. Obviously, children aren't supposed to have access to this. And this person, who I'm not going to name because, again, I don't want to give them any credit for the horrible thing they did, I believe was approaching 18. They were a week or two away from being 18. So, yes, they could have access to Call of Duty. But they shouldn't have had access to this kind of weapon, right, at that age, without adult supervision, without somebody with them. So then my question becomes, if you want to ask these questions about manufacturing or law or parenting, Those are questions that I think you can ask, but I think that to push these things, these issues off over and over again on entertainment, what it does is it undermines those questions. I've noticed something too, like, and this, somebody could say, well, this is because of entertainment. This is because of video games. When my dad was a kid, years and years ago, and he has since passed, but when he was a kid, kids would bring their weapons in the back of their truck to school and leave them in the parking lot. And they would go hunting, sometimes after school. Or they would go shoot skeet or something, whatever, shoot cans, things like this. That's what they did. They didn't care. Kids were smoking cigarettes at 11 too. So I'm not saying that that was a good thing. Like, oh boy, this is a great idea. But my point is, kids were taught to respect these things. They were taught that there were consequences for your actions. They weren't taught to try and cause as much pain as possible and then take a coward's way out. They were essentially taught, like, these are weapons, these are things that matter. And there was also at the time, whether you personally agree with this or not, sort of a shared moral fabric in the United States. At the time, I would argue that most people, or many people, were either deist or Christian or Jewish or some kind of monotheistic faith. And they shared that common fabric. They shared these ideas of heaven, hell, being a good person, trying to do things for other people, Good Samaritan type stuff. And whether you agree with that kind of stuff or not, that's what a lot of our law in that Constitution and things are based off of, is those deistic, monotheistic principles of morality through that kind of belief. Now, over time, we have, in a lot of ways, abandoned that type of belief in this country. And I'm not someone who I would say is a super conventional Christian by any means. I am somebody who believes in some of that stuff. Like, I believe in God. I do believe in Jesus. Those are my opinions. But at the end of the day, I think people never replaced that moral fabric. This is something that, as somebody who studied literature, I noticed in the United Kingdom especially too, like around World War I, when you were starting to get things like evolutionary theory was taking up, Darwinism, things like that. A lot of people were questioning their belief systems, and belief systems were becoming much more diverse. Now, diverse belief systems, diverse people can be a really good thing, but a problem with it is that sometimes it lacks a unifying feature. It lacks something that we all have in common. Now, fortunately, most of us are smart enough and mentally stable enough to realize that murder is bad. Whether there's a God, whether there's not, whether you could go to hell, whether it doesn't exist, most people are sound, stable, and intelligent enough to realize that. But unfortunately, as moral fabric has broken down, especially in the West, and not been replaced by anything really solid or standard, I personally believe that a lot of people haven't known what to place the basis of their morality in. So we have a lot of parents that aren't able to teach kids why something is good or bad. In the past, it was easier. It really was. And you know why it was? Because you could say, hey, if you do that, you'll go to hell. Hey, if you do that, you're directly killing a spiritual being. You could do stuff like that. Nowadays, it's a lot harder to do that because people don't have those beliefs. You have to find other justifications for your morals. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are atheistic or people who are, any other belief system don't have morals. But what it means is that I think a lot of parents, they lost that safety net for what they could use to instruct their kids. You know what I mean? Like, they lost that unifying feature. Instead of you want to do the right thing because you want to be a good person, a lot of parents don't know how to actually teach their kids morality anymore. They don't have that unifying moral fabric that everybody had. Take your kids to church on Sunday, they get it drilled into their head how to behave, which in some ways had a lot of problems as well. We've seen that in the Catholic Church with abusive children and things. But there were a lot of people who used that as the moral basis at home for how to teach their kids to behave, how to respect weapons, how to respect death, how to understand that life is fleeting whether there was something after or not. And as people have become more disenfranchised and believe in less and less, and our country has become more and more divided, especially between the two-party system, which our founding fathers never wanted, by the way. We've gone on record in the past saying that was not a good idea to just transition from, England into a party system here, but people ignored them. since we did those things, people are very divided, and people use different things on both sides to try and justify morals or to try and justify control. And instead of looking at those kinds of things, looking at like our society, why people believe or don't believe what they believe now, where people are basing their morals, where people are getting their ideas of glorifying violence. Instead of looking at those things, because even like Call of Duty, like you're never actually playing as the bad guy, really. In the few cases you do, you later on kill said bad guy. So even in cases like this, it feels very out of touch to me to blame something that is out there in the entertainment sphere when so many other people are interacting with that thing every day and having no problems. And it makes me wonder where you kind of draw the line. Like a game like Fortnite, for example, which I'm not going to go into any kind of plug here for, but I like Fortnite. That game is obviously much more directed at younger people. There are guns in it. So does that game cause violence? I don't think it does. I haven't seen any kind of... I've seen no evidence that that's the case. I've seen no evidence that any video games cause violence of any kind. The most I've seen is that people get crabby. The one thing I ever see come up during this discussion is, well, there are some researchers who have found that there is a little bit more aggression sometimes when playing games. You know what that is? It's like I died to a Dark Souls boss, I get mad and I slam my controller on my leg like a toddler. That's not like I died to a Dark Souls boss, I go down to the local Renaissance fair, I pick up a sword, I buy it cheap, and then I head out to the local public event to cause some mayhem. That's not what it is. I'm obviously more stable than that, right? And so you have to ask yourself, where is the instability coming from? Where is the moral instability coming from? Where is the lack of understanding and respecting what these tools, weapons, any of these things can do? Where is the lack of respecting life coming from? Because I don't personally think it's coming from just books or games or comics or any of this. And as a society, we've always tried to blame these things. Going back, comic books were blamed for violence, believe it or not, back in the day. There were novels blamed for violence and acts of sexual misconduct. There were, movies were blamed for a while. And video games are, I would say, the newest form of these things, so it's the easiest to go after. But it's just, to me, going to cheapen the loss of life. It's going to make these things seem less serious. And when I see this kind of thing, my immediate opinion is, is someone trying to use this situation for money? Which totally detracts from the loss of life. That totally detracts from real questions that should be asked about our world or about our laws or any of these things. It makes it so that we can't have those discussions because all it does is further disenfranchise people. Now, somebody might make a buck off of it, but that's not going to help kids in the future. That's not going to help adults in the future feel more safe. Or it's also not going to help freedom. It's not going to help either side. And so when I see this stuff, it's just extremely disappointing because I would think that people would be smarter than this now, but it seems like every year people are more stupid. So I don't know. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts down below because it's just mind-boggling to me that I'm reading about this now. This is something that I would have read about Mortal Kombat back in the 80s and 90s, not something in 2024. I thought we were past this, but there's every day I am flabbergasted by something that I thought we were past, that I was past a long time ago, that other people are still cavemaning their way out of. So let me know what you think in the comments down below if you enjoyed the video. Leave a like, subscribe. I hope you have a fantastic day. And as always, everyone, stay shui. And if you ever have kids, please try really hard to raise those kids to respect these things and respect life, regardless of what you base those teachings off of. I don't think there's enough of that in our society. And I personally think that for parents and adults and all these people, it's much easier to look outward than inward. So that's my opinion.